CLP Video, Master Books, and Creation Science Ministries present Answers in Genesis. Session number 8, Genes and Genesis. Featuring internationally recognized author and speaker on the topic of creation versus evolution, Gary Parker.
Well, we've now had time to share with you, both Ken and I, a lot of evidence of creation from the world round about us. But I guess it's about time we confessed that all that evidence was good only until 1859. What happened in 1859? As many of you know, that was the time when Darwin published his famous book, Origin of Species. That Origin of Species has been called by many historians second only to the Bible in its influence on human history, and many would now put it first. It really was the start of a revolution, turning the world upside down. It was Darwin's way of explaining all appearance of design without any reference to a designer at all. It wasn't really a scientific revolution. The idea of natural selection we associate with Darwin had actually been published 24 years earlier by a creationist, Edward Blyth. But Blyth made no more out of natural selection than we could actually observe. The Darwinists turned natural selection into a substitute for God and alternate religion. As profound as the idea is, it was actually based on some fairly simple observations. Darwin got his idea of natural selection simply from observing the effects of artificial selection. And all of you are familiar with examples. Ken talked with you the other day about the various kinds of dogs and made some, well, unkind remarks about bulldogs and poodles, but at any rate, you recognize there are lots of kinds of dogs and cats and cattle and so on. One that attracted Darwin's attention were the pigeons. And believe it or not, all the pigeons you see in the diagram here can be bred from just this wild rock pigeon that hangs around barns and statues and so on. From those pigeons, you can get some with a pretty little crest on the head with a big neck pouch down here with a spray of tail feathers and so on. And you can take these and cross them and breed them right back to the wild rock pigeon here. One time in San Diego, we stumbled across a goldfish breeders convention. And you'd be surprised what goldfish breeders have been able to do to those hapless little critters. Some of them had their eyeballs hanging out on stalks and all kinds of frilly feathers and so on. There's certainly a lot of things that have been done as a result of selective breeding by man. Darwin said, I believe nature can select as well as man. Aha! Is there any evidence that Darwin was right about natural selection, that nature can select? And of course, the answer to that question is absolutely, overwhelmingly, beyond a shadow of a doubt. There is an abundance of evidence that Darwin was absolutely correct about this idea of natural selection. And of course, the example that's been used to prove the point all the way along is the famous peppered moth, Byston bechellaria. And so back in England, back in the 1850s, there were tree trunks in England on which these moths would rest during the daytime, fly around at night. Well, back then, the tree trunks were covered with this kind of lichen growth, and they had a light-colored, little peppered background to them and so on. And so back in the 1850s, the light moth was camouflaged. In fact, if you look at the photograph here, you might be hard-pressed to find just exactly where it is. The light-colored moth, but the dark-colored moth is no problem at all. There it is. Presumably, that's the way the birds saw it. So as they flew around looking for something to eat, they'd miss the light-colored moth and easily find and eat the dark-colored moth. So back in the 1850s, there were only about 2% of the population were dark-colored, 98% were the camouflaged light-colored. But then along came the Industrial Revolution and pumped soot into the atmosphere and so on. So the soot actually rained down the bark of the trees and accumulated in little puddles, killed the lichen on the trees, and now it was a dark moth that was camouflaged. So in just 100 years, the population shifted from 2% dark to 2% light. This was the one that now stood out, and the dark moth was the one that was camouflaged. There you have it. Evolution going on today. At least that's what I used to tell my students when I believed in evolution. Once in a while, you'd get those cantankerous students like Ken Ham used to be. Would say, please, sir, if evolution is true, you know, how do we see evolution going on? I wouldn't back off. I didn't say it was too slow or too fast. I said we can see it going on, and launch into the story of the peppered moth here. And so this looks like, this is the one that still, the studies were done back in the 50s, but it's still the one that evolutionists point to as proof positive that evolution is a fact, something you can see and verify right before your very eyes. Well, what would a creationist say about that? Well, keep in mind, the best argument for evolution is what? The word change. And I bet a lot of you got trapped into that argument. People ask you, do you believe in evolution? You'll say no. And so they'll say, you mean you don't believe in change? Well, what are you going to say? Sure, I believe in change. I've got some in my pocket. You can hear it rattle around. At least I suggest that, because they try to trick you into thinking if you believe in any kind of change at all, you must be an evolutionist. Oh, no. Change has a lot of different meanings. And so we want to pin down what kind of change are we talking about. Talk about loose change in your pocket. You can talk about, I see, you know, evidence for evolution. I saw a dead animal beside the road. That's a change. Tornadoes and typhoons wipe out, you know, great big islands and things like that. That's change. And then the evolutionist has said, well, wait a minute. That's not the kind of change I'm talking about. I mean an increase in the quantity and quality of genetic information. Now, that's evolution. More genes, more information, better genes, better information. And then you say, yeah, what about the peppered moth? Does that show us evolution? What was it to start with? Moth species, Byston betullaria, several color forms from light to dark. What was it at the end of the observations? Moth species, Byston betullaria, several color forms from dark to light. What was the one thing that never changed? The moth species, Byston betullaria. The one thing this isn't is an example of evolution. Suppose you let that go on for 50 trillion years. What do you got? Moth species, Byston betullaria, several color forms from light to dark. As a matter of fact, now that the forests are being cleaned up and so on, and the lichen is making it come back, the moth is shifting back to that earlier form. And so if natural selection had completely wiped out one, it'd be on the way to extinction, not on the way to evolution. Where did the gene come from? As far as our observations is concerned, it was always there. This doesn't even illustrate the addition of a mutation, any change in the genetic structure at all, just the percentages of the different color forms, explaining not how the species originate, but only how and where they survive as they multiply and fill the earth. Now, that was Blyth's idea as a creation scientist. That's based on what we can actually see and observe after death entered the world, after the fall and after the flood. As things begin to multiply and fill the earth, natural selection helps us to sort out where they are found, how they moved into one area rather than another. Natural selection, yes. Evolution, no. That's the problem. Now, if a scientist takes a look at this, you can say, well, now, wait a minute. If you just wait long enough, time is the hero of the plot, the process of natural selection, if you give it a longer time, can be extrapolated to explain not just moth to moth, but molecule to man, to use the title of one of our government-sponsored textbooks indoctrinating people in evolution and so on. Well, extrapolation is a legitimate scientific enterprise, like, you know, looking at the population of the world and trying to project what the population will be in the future. But every time you extrapolate, you have to ask, what are the limits? What are the boundary conditions? How far can I logically take this idea without getting into trouble? So let's take a look at natural selection. Natural selection, yes, but I think we can identify several limits that tell us evolution, no. One of the biggest problems with natural selection is compound traits, traits that depend on more than one structure working together at the same time. Well, this morning I shared with you one of my favorite examples, the woodpecker. This afternoon I might share with you Dr. Gish's favorite example, and I guess my second favorite example, these little teeny critters that we call bombardier beetles. Very unassuming in appearance. We have some, you know, in our science center back at Clearwater Christian. Just a little teeny beetle, not very long, kind of colorful, but not too extraordinary. And here you see a beetle in deep trouble. Up behind him, there's sneaking a mean old beetle eater, like a frog or a toad, ready to flip out his tongue, snap up this free lunch, and just as he opens his mouth, boom, off goes this explosion, sending dust and gas at 100 degrees centigrade, the boiling point of water, into the mouth of the would-be beetle eater. Now, it doesn't kill the frog or toad, but it definitely kills his taste for beetles. And in fact, in the photographs we have back at ICR, the last scene shows a hapless toad dragging his tongue across the sand, trying to get rid of this foul-tasting stuff. Well, the chemicals involved in this are simple enough. Hydrogen peroxide, the same kind of stuff used to bleach hair and fizz bacteria out of a wound and so on. Hydroquinone, some chemicals used to develop film. And so those are the two chemicals that the beetle uses. And then he's got some cannons at the rear that store this thing, and they can actually fire 300 times before they run out of chemicals and have to go off and hide and reload somewhere along the line. You can almost imagine a warm spring evening. One beetle says to another beetle, let's go down by the pond and have some fun. Boom, 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 blasting their way through a line of frogs. But you have to kind of wonder now, once it's got all that in place, it's fit to survive, but how did it get it? You know, a step at a time. In Darwinism, that was supposedly Darwin's genius, that everything happened one little itty-bitty step at a time over a long period of millions of years. But that means each one of these had to have survival value. So again, it's like the woodpecker. You have a beetle wandering across an area, you know, minding its own. This Zotz gets hit by one of those magic cosmic rays. And all of a sudden, it begins to mass produce hydrogen peroxide. First step to becoming a bombardier beetle, right? Nah, fizzes himself to death. All that peroxide outside the storage chamber, you're in real trouble. Yes, I wouldn't do it. Well, maybe you got the hydroquinones, you know, first. Well, they just sit there and soak and sour, and nothing happens, you know, until you get maybe one of those miracles of evolution. Zotz, he got hit by two cosmic rays at the same time. He got both chemicals at once, the peroxides and hydrogen quinone. Now he's on the way to becoming a bombardier beetle, right? Boom, blows off his rear end. If you get those two chemicals together, you don't have the storage chambers, you're in real trouble. Well, I think you can see the idea. You've got to have all of those working together at the same time before any of them has survival value. I think, now I have to admit, I got this out of a very reputable science encyclopedia, so I'm going to assume that it's really true. It could be God was trying to make this point with Charles Darwin a long time ago. Now, Darwin, to his credit, Darwin really was a good naturalist, a keen observer, and so on, and in sailing around the world on the HMS Beagle and so on, he collected everything, including beetles, lots and lots of beetles and insects, and so sailing around South America, he has his pockets full of beetles, pants pockets full of beetles. His pith helmet had beetles under. And so he's heading back to the ship, you know, and a devoted naturalist and so on. He finds one more beetle. Well, where are you going to put it? Well, he could just barely get hold of it with his fingers like this. And the only place he could think of to put it was open his mouth. Boom, off goes this explosion. So it may have been that God was really trying to capture his attention at that time. Now, you have to blame that on a well-known science encyclopedia rather than me. And this is not the end of the story at all. At one time, I thought it'd be fun to write a book, 100,000 evidences of creation, just going through all the wonders that we have in the world right around about us. Down in Florida, I get to take the students on scuba diving trips down to the Florida Keys each spring as part of our marine biology class. Dirty, rotten, miserable job, but somebody's got to do it. And so as we're down there under the waves and so on, looking at things, one of the fabulous things you can see are these cleaning stations. I've gotten to see them also out in the Barrier Reef in Australia. And here you see one of these barracuda that love to watch scuba divers. But they'll come cruising up to one of these cleaning stations. Here's a fish 6 feet long or 2 meters long with these great big pointed fangs. It cruises up and opens its mouth. Well, if you're a little fish and you see a bunch of fangs cruising in your direction, what would you do naturally? Well, you'd think you'd run for cover. But instead, these little brightly colored fish out there, little brightly colored shrimp, just swim right into the jaws of death and begin picking off debris and junk and so on in the mouth of the fish. There are even little shrimp that crawl right out there on the gills and pick parasites off the gills and things like that. And it's fairly fabulous. And there's several species of fish involved, several species of little fish and big fish involved in this thing. And you might think, well, the big fish would say, clean teeth, snap, free meal, and have the best of both worlds. But for some reason, they don't do that. Here's a whole complex series of behavioral adaptations in a multitude of species, all having to work together at the same time. So instead of this result, you get this result here. The fish gets a clean mouth, the little fish get plenty to eat, and then, in our fallen world, a big fish swims off to eat other fish again. And it's just an amazing one. There's a famous Nobel Prize winner looking at this particular situation. He says, I'm unable to approach this kind of problem without supposing an innate drive in matter to perfect itself. There must be at least a creative force, if not a creator God. Interestingly enough, he called that creative force syntropy, the opposite of entropy, the universal law of decay. But at least he was on the right track. There has to be at least a creative force. And the examples multiply. In Australia this summer, I heard about one I hadn't heard from before, the creation group over there. There's this hammer orchid or hinge orchid, beautiful orchid and so on, and it's got a little petal on the orchid, I'll call it, that looks like a female wasp. And so the male wasp is flying around, looking for a female wasp at a certain time of year, and he spots this petal. It looks just like a female wasp. So he comes down there, lands on what he thinks is a female wasp, and there's a little hinge that gives way, and wham! The orchid hammers him over into the pollen, dusts him all up with pollen, So he wakes up, flies off, his last off, what a woman, okay? Away he goes to pollinate another flower. Amazing adaptation, just all over the place like that. And at least it's to Darwin's credit that he recognized that things like that were not an evidence for the theory of evolution. We often forget about that. Darwin was not a very enthusiastic Darwinist. He waited 20 years to publish his theory because he thought scientists would ridicule it. He knew he didn't have the support for it. And it was Darwin who talked about the human eye, to suppose that the human eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for focusing at different distances, admitting different amounts of light, correcting for spherical and chromatic aberration, to suppose that the eye or any of these compound traits could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, said Darwin, absurd in the highest degree. His chapter on adaptations wasn't evidence of the theory, it was titled Difficulties with the Theory. Another leading anti-creationist once put it this way, that things like this were, and I say are, the chief evidence of a supreme designer. Well, that's one problem, is that you can't go from natural selection to evolution because you can't get past the compound trait barrier. That's one of the real limits to extrapolating from natural selection to evolution. The other one is simply a matter of origins. Well, there's several more I go over in my classes, but the major ones here, compound traits and origins. Natural selection is a hindsight theory. The one thing Darwin never really addressed in his book, Origin of Species, was the origin of species. The full title was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And he talked a lot about the preservation of favored races, but where did they come from? Where did the new traits come from to begin with? Think of Darwin's finches, this group of birds on the Galapagos Islands, for which Darwin is famous, and so on. How did Darwin explain the origin of the Galapagos finches? Exactly the same way a knowledgeable, Bible-believing Christian would. He said, as I was sailing around the South American mainland, I saw finches with a variety of big types, big ones, little ones, and so on. It says, perhaps in some kind of storm, a mat of vegetation washed out into the ocean. There were some birds and plants, and they got carried to these islands. And then as they multiplied on these islands, those with the little beaks survived on the islands where there were plenty of insects to eat, and they could move their beaks rapidly. Those with the big beaks survived where there were lots of seeds they could crush as a food source. In other words, what? These things were multiplying and refilling the earth after the fall and after the flood. If you have variety to start with, then you can explain how and where it survives, not how it originated. In fact, for origin, for where did these traits come from in the first place, Darwin didn't use natural selection to explain origin, but only survival. To explain origin, Darwin believed in pangenesis, use and disuse, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Some secular textbooks falsely distinguish between Darwin and the Frenchman Lamarck on that point. Darwin also believed, and this was an example Darwin used. The giraffe originated its long neck by stretching for the leaves in the tree. As some drought dried out the prairie grass, then it began to stretch and so on. And then here's the mistake he made. A lot of scientists in his day made it, that as they stretched for these leaves in the tree, at the time of reproduction, all these stretched muscles would make more pangenes that would flow through the reproductive organ. The next generation would start with a longer neck. Well, it was an interesting idea, but we found out since totally false. That characteristics you acquire, like you can go to the gym and work out, you know, you too can have a body like this. Wouldn't take very much, would it? But your little baby, you don't have to laugh that loud. But your babies are going to start off soft and flabby. They're not going to start off inheriting all the exercise you did and so on. And so the modern evolutionist recognizes that. So modern evolution is called neo-Darwinism. We've thrown out pangenesis, kept natural selection. The new thing that's added is what? Mutations. These random changes in heredity. That's the raw material for evolution. Well, it's certainly true that mutations occur. And my students in their genetics class, like students right around the world in genetics class, do experiments with these cute little fruit flies. And you can see here's a relatively normal one. Here's one with these spread apart wings and rudimentary wings, miniature wings, vestigial wings, skewed cross-veinless cut wings. And so there are a lot of things that radiation damage has done to fruit flies and so on that represent mutations. So mutations, yes, they really do occur. Evolution, no. In fact, what we know about mutation shows us several limits that prevent us from extrapolating logically, scientifically from mutations to evolution. The first are the mathematical problems, and these are very well known and admitted by evolutionists. Mutations, fortunately, as we'll see, mutations do a lot of harm. They're great at explaining the origin of disease, as we talked about last evening. Fortunately, they're fairly rare. And so mutations, on average, a gene mutates about once in every 10 million duplications. That's a real rough average. Or if you had a population of 10 million, like bacteria in a test tube, there's a pretty good chance of finding a mutation of some gene in that particular organism. So they're rare, but don't get trapped there. They're not that rare. In that sense, a test tube of bacteria is likely to have a bacterium that's mutated. You and I have about 100,000 genes from each parent, about 200,000 genes. And in us, it seems like the mutation rate's about 1 in 200,000. Or excuse me, 1 in 100,000. So the average person is typically born with 2 genes neither of its parents had that are a result of mutations. The problem mathematically is trying to get these mutations to add up to produce something really new. If you're going to change a fin into a foot, a leg into a wing, an amoeba into a man, you've got to do more than just 1 or 2 mutations. You've got to have several of them working together to build a new structure. What are the chances of just 2 related mutations? It's not 2 times 10 to the minus 7. It is 1 in 100 trillion. Uh-oh. Now the odds of bacteria having 2 related mutations, you need something as big as the Gulf of Mexico to find that. When you get to 4 mutations, it goes up to 1 in 10,000 trillion, a 1 followed by 28 zeros. And that's just bacteria, maybe resistant to 4 antibiotics. That's all that is. At this point, real scientists said, wait a minute, mutation theory doesn't work. We've got to look for something else. It just plain doesn't work. We used to think that bacteria became resistant to antibiotics by mutation. In the lab, they do. You can make them resistant by mutation, but those are evolutionary cripples. The mutation has broken down an enzyme, so they can't even survive well in the normal environment. In the real world, the ones that are threatening are the bacteria that have little loops of DNA called plasmids that make enzymes that break down the antibiotic. And they trade them around in a form of sexual reproduction called conjugation. And so scientists said, this is impossible. We've got to look for another explanation. They looked for it, and they found it. That's the way scientists normally look at statistics. When the odds get that low, they say, hey, that's not going to work. Let's look for another idea. Suppose somebody came to you and said, boy, you know, I've really been on a lucky streak. I've won the lottery in my state each week for the past 10 years. How many of you would believe that? Okay. But an evolutionist comes along, odds a lot less than that, says, you know, I think life is thrown together by a chance combination of molecules in the ancient oceans. What do people say? Sounds good to me. It's impossible to believe. If it weren't for that presuppositional bias, how in the world would anybody believe that? There are a couple of scientists in England that did some calculations. What are the odds of just getting, you know, if you just had the simplest organism imaginable, and there was some process that was producing the DNA and protein, so it's very generous to evolutionists, what would be the odds of getting a living cell on a roll of the molecular dice? Their figure, 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. And they said it this way. That would be like the odds of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard, spontaneously assembling a Boeing 747. And what do evolutionists say? That's it. Boy, that just shows how powerful natural selection is. And they laugh at us for believing in miracles? That's got to be really astonishing. By the way, what do tornadoes do when they sweep through junkyards? Do they put things together? No, they tear them apart. And so they're being far too generous. Sometimes I like to say it like this. The odds of getting life on a roll of the molecular dice are like the odds of getting a 13 on a pair of regular dice. How long would you have to roll the dice to get a 13? Wouldn't make any difference, would it? The numbers only add up to 12. You just can't get there from here. And that's what computers are telling us. You know what, they had a conference a few years ago that had a revolutionary impact on evolutionists. They plugged all this stuff about evolution into a computer and said, okay, calculate how evolution occurs. Whir, clang, bang, you know, and the computer spits out this answer. This does not compute. You know, you got to give me more information. This doesn't work. You know, I can't play around with this. This doesn't work at all. In fact, I think if we could really train a computer, you know, give it all the information on the human being and so on, put it into this computer and say, you know, how did I get here? And whir, clank, bang, and so on, spits out this message. It says, it looks like you got here by special creation. Somebody put you together on purpose. Whir, clank, bang. Whoever put you together did a lot better job than you did putting me together. If we could get rid of that bias, I think we could accept the evidence for exactly what it is. And against those odds, I remember as an evolutionist saying, well, you got to remember how long 5 billion years is. It's only 10 to the 17th seconds. In 10 to the 23rd millionths of a second, the rate for biochemical reactions, nothing compared to the odds against evolution. And that's not even a strong argument. Even if you have mutations, even if there's some way to get around the mathematical arguments, the big problem is mutations are going in the wrong way as far as evolution is concerned. Evolution is supposed to be an increase in genetic information, an increase in the quantity and quality of information. And yet what they are typographic errors, a decrease. They're recognized by the diseases and abnormalities that they cause. All scientists recognize this. Genetics textbook always talk about genetic burden, genetic load, dragging down the quality of a species and so on. One of the textbooks I had showed this hapless turkey born with a single set of chromosomes from an unfertilized egg. The head wobbled from side to side in a neurological disorder. The feathers were missing in patches. It had to be transferred to a germ-free chamber. It got sick so easily and so on. There, but for 2 sets of chromosomes, go you and I. The number of harmful mutations that have accumulated in the human population is so severe that it threatens species survival. Francisco Ayala knows that. Here he's a leading evolutionist, and I use some of his materials in my classes and so on. In the last chapter in his book, what does the future hold? What does the future hold? Well, he's an evolutionist. You might say, wow, the future is just limitless. Pretty soon we'll have people with IQs of 200, 300. We'll have people running the 2-minute mile. They'll be, you know, doing a 25-foot high jump and all these kind of things. Wow, ain't evolution wonderful? No. His last chapter, how can we save ourselves from mutation? So there's built up so much in the human population, in animal and plant populations. What can we do? How can we keep this from continuing to occur? There's a little town in Italy. They actually have lists posted in the town hall. There's a blood disease, thalassemia, that's so common there. You're supposed to consult that list before you get serious about dating someone to at least know what are the odds that your children will die of that terrible disease and so on. Genetic burden, the opposite of evolution. Well, the evolutionist usually says, oh, well, you know, if you wait long enough, there's this good mutation that occurs once in a while. Any examples of a good mutation? It's kind of interesting. One of our students from Clearwater Christian graduated just recently. Just finished his master's degree and is back teaching in our area. So he took the evolution course right off when he got there. By the way, said he didn't learn anything he hadn't already learned from us. But at one point, you know, the teacher was going on and on about mutations as a raw material for evolution and so on. And so Jeff just raised his hand. And, you know, non-threatening, he just said, would you please give us some examples of good mutations? And he had his pencil poised, ready to take a list. In fact, he thought, well, maybe Parker hadn't told him right. They really got a long list. So he's waiting there. Long, kind of embarrassing silence. Finally, the prof says, I can't think of any right off, but there must be hundreds of them. Okay. He didn't come into class the next day with hundreds of them either. In fact, as I've asked that question, the only example of a good mutation we've ever gotten is this one. Sickle cell anemia. That doesn't sound like a good mutation, does it? Well, you'll see it in genetics book after genetics book after genetics book. And so hemoglobin is the molecule that carries oxygen in red blood cells. There is a mutant form of this hemoglobin that doesn't carry oxygen very well, sickle cell hemoglobin. So it's certainly not an improvement in genetic quality and quantity, but if you have one gene for bad hemoglobin, one gene for good hemoglobin, you won't die of malaria. You're so sick, the malaria parasite will leave you alone. And so there are certain parts of Central Africa where the death rate from malaria is so high that carriers, you know, don't die of malaria. And so that's kind of nice. The problem is a quarter of their children can still die of malaria. A quarter of their children can still die of sickle cell anemia. Is that a good mutation? Spare me from those kind of good mutations. And it will only build up so far. You know, evolution is limitless genetic expansion, yet when that gene reaches the 18% level, which it has in some populations, that's it. That's where the death rate from sickle cell anemia and malaria balance out. Not continuous upward, onward progress, certainly no increase in the quantity and quality of genetic information. One of the first books I wrote besides DNA was on heredity. When I wrote it, I was an evolutionist, didn't have any problems and so on. When we got ready to do the second edition, I was going through things and my co-author said, you know, I notice every time we talk about mutations in our book on heredity, it's always something bad. Don't you think we should put in a statement that we're here, after all, as a result of mutations? And that was the first time I had a chance to share with her that I had since become a Christian. And I really think she might very well be a Christian herself, but she hadn't really thought much about this creation stuff. So I said, if we put that in, I've got to put in the creation side. Well, she didn't want to do that, so she said, let's just ask for some examples of good mutations. The only one we ever got was sickle cell anemia, and neither one of us was willing to put that in there. And that's not even the end of the story. Number three, not only are creation and mathematics make it impossible to extrapolate from mutations to evolution, they're going the wrong way. And then number three, mutations point back to creation. Now, what do I mean by that? Notice I do not mean mean that mutations are God's means of creation. No, they're the way that we explain the corruption of the created order. They explain birth defects and disease organisms and so on. But they point back to a prior act of creation, creation before the fall in this sense. What does the radiation or the chemical accident has to occur to a gene that already exists? Some people have the idea that, you know, radiation hits a cell and wham, out comes a brand new gene. A string of 1,500 bases or something like that is just brought into being. No, mutations are just typos. They're just one-letter changes most often in a great big chain of DNA. All you get from mutations are what scientists call alleles, variation of genes that already exist. All you can get from mutations is just variation within kind, not change from one kind to another. And when you stop to think about it, isn't that exactly what we observe? We live in a world where there are lots and lots of changes. Flies are resistant to DDT. Did they become resistant to DDT? Did they evolve that? No. The The first time DDT was sprayed on flies, about 2% of them survived. They had an alternate chemical pathway that wasn't affected by the poison. Peppered moth starts as a peppered moth, stays a peppered moth. Considerable variation in color, but still the same kind. The flu virus certainly mutates, and you get different strains of it every year, but it still gives you the flu. It's still the flu virus. Drug-resistant bacteria we talked about. Dogs, cats, corn, selective breeding, Darwin finches, fruit flies. Evidence of change from one kind to another? No. Not if logic and observation mean anything in science. Evidence of variation within kind? You bet. Lots of variation within kind, but that's as far as it goes. But I'd better warn you about something just in case. Evolutionists do think they have one example of something that really shows change from one kind to another. This is the one I used to use. Occasionally you'd get those kids that would come to class, and say something awful like, well, if evolution is true, where are all the missing links? Where are all those changes from one kind to another? I didn't duck the issue as an evolution. I say, glad you brought that up. We have a perfect example of a fossil caught halfway between reptile and bird. And I bet a lot of you know what I'm talking about. It's that fossil called Archaeopteryx that was either discovered or invented, that's a side issue, back in 1860. It was the one used by Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, to convince many people that evolution had to be true. Here's the way the animal would look reconstructed. It's got feathers, it's got wings. You might say, well, gee, it looks an awful lot like a bird. What's the big question? But if you take a closer look, in the bill there are teeth. On the claws on the wings there are claws. There's no keel down the breastbone like there would be in a chicken or a turkey. There's a long bony tail. Those are things we normally find in reptiles. This is the way the fossil looked as they found it and so on. There it is, halfway between a reptile and a bird. At least that's what I used to say, till I had a chance to take a look at it again. Dr. Gish's book, Evolution, The Challenge of the Fossil Record, goes through a lot of these things in detail and so on. And so, sure enough, there are no living birds that have teeth in their bill, but there's several fossil birds that have teeth. And when you stop to think about it, there's some reptiles that have teeth and some don't. Turtles don't have teeth. And let's see, as I look around here, it looks like some of you have teeth and some don't. And so that's not really important in classifying what you are or what you aren't and so on. Claws on the wings, the ostrich has claws on the wings. And so do a couple of less familiar forms, the Hoatzin and the Turako. Lack of a keel down the breastbone, there are other birds that have that. Unfused tail vertebrae, so does the penguin. There's not a single feature that Archaeopteryx has that isn't shared by some other bird. Even evolutionists are now referring to this as a first bird, not at all a transitional form. In fact, it can't be, because now we have found bones of regular birds, just ordinary birds, in rock layers much deeper than those in which the fossils of Archaeopteryx are entombed. The Archaeopteryx fossils we have could not possibly be the ancestors of those birds, since they already existed. Well, evolutionists are never caught off guard by evidence, so as they make this the first bird, they've shifted gears now. This is the one that's used, and this is used seriously in several debates. Dr. Gish has gotten in this one in debates and so on. They don't use Archaeopteryx. They'll say, Dr. Gish says there are no missing links. Well, we've got a perfect one, Proavis. Okay, not the first rental car, but a particular kind of bird here. And notice this is a little better story really than Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx has completely formed, fully functional traits. It has fully formed and functional wings with a shaft toward the leading edge, a characteristic of strong flyers. It has an extremely robust furcula or wishbone, a characteristic of strong flying birds and so on. It has perching feet like birds and so on. And so it just looks like a regular bird. But now this is something a little bit different. Here you have a reptile. There were lots of two-legged reptiles, two-legged dinosaurs running around and so on. Zotz gets hit by a cosmic ray, and a little reptile is born with some frayed scales. Okay, frayed scales on his forearms. The Archaeopteryx has regular feathers, but here's some frayed scales that aren't really used in flight yet. They're used to catch insects. Okay. Then another mutation comes along. He gets bigger frayed scales, so now when an insect starts to take off, it can jump up after him. Well, good stirring story, isn't it? Sometimes I like to ask young people, what do you think about the Proavis story? And boy, if you're talking to kindergartner through second grade, hands shoot up all over the room like that. And one young person said, you know, if he jumped up and caught something in the air, wouldn't he crash back down to the ground? Very good point. Yeah, he would. Another one said, you know, if he started pecking insects out of his wings, wouldn't he tear his feathers up altogether? Yeah, that's a pretty good point. And then, you know, somebody said, well, you know, reaching around and grabbing like this, that would be the opposite of pushing the air back to fly. And that's true, too. Anybody here ever tie towels to your arms and try to jump off the garage roof and fly? Well, I hope I'm not the only one. But I will tell you, when I did that, sometimes I get to the edge of the garage roof, I was so tired from all that flapping, I couldn't even jump off the roof. And so even the fellow that proposed this idea says the muscle action is exactly the opposite of the muscle action a bird would need, and that guess what? He also admits no fossil evidence of any such thing exists. It's a purely hypothetical pre-bird, but one that must have existed. Okay? If it's purely hypothetical, it's a mechanical monstrosity, and there's no evidence for it, why must it have existed? He's being consistent with his presuppositions, isn't he? And what Ken is challenging us as Christians, well, let's us be consistent with our presuppositions even more than the evolutionists are. He's being consistent with his presuppositions, but it's an act of faith. The facts have failed. And we're not asking for the impossible, feathers preserved. We find feathers, we find scales, we never find anything in between. Bones preserved, we find legs, we find wings, we never find anything in between. And yet if this existed, there ought to be lots and lots of these that have been recovered from all over the earth and so on. Well, step 3. Okay, so it's not Archaeopteryx, it's not Proavis. The hottest new idea that Ken introduced you to is punctuated equilibrium, or the so-called hopeful monster mechanism. The first bird hatched out of a reptile egg. At least that's the way one scientist, Schindewolf, put it a few years ago. That's why we don't find those missing links. That was Goldschmidt's idea, that here maybe what happens in evolution is not just one little mutation, but radical rearrangements of whole sets of chromosomes, systemic mutations, mutations in regulator genes that change everything. So lo and behold, the first bird hatches out of a reptile egg. Is that serious stuff? Oh, you bet it's serious. In fact, there's a fabulous book. It's a children's book. Now you'd say, well, why would I quote a children's book? Well, because it was endorsed by the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It was endorsed by the American Council on Education. This is the best science and the best education that's available. This thing really has some powerful endorsements. And it starts off talking about a mother dinosaur laid an egg. And then the question, was it a dinosaur egg? Well, back when kids grew up on farms, the answer was obvious. Chicks lay chick eggs, ducks lay duck eggs, dinosaurs lay dinosaur eggs. But then it goes to, was it a stegosaur egg? No. Was it an allosaur egg? No. Was it this? Was it that? No, it was a wonderful new kind of egg laid by a dinosaur mother. And when it hatched, it hatched into a baby bird. The first baby bird in the whole world. And this is the drawing they have in this children's book. You can imagine how excited kids are about this. When it hatched into a baby bird, the first baby bird in the whole world. And the baby bird grew up to be a beautiful bird with feathers. The first beautiful bird that ever sang a song. The wings worked. It flew all the way up into the trees. The voice box worked. Now it was singing instead of grunting and hissing and so on. In the green new world of long, long ago. Well, that's palmed off as good science and good education. Well, it's certainly an interesting idea, but Stephen Gould proposed at one time that there'd be a resurrection of the idea of big jumping evolution, big step evolution, saltatory stuff and so on. But even Gould admitted there were a couple of problems. And you ask a high school student, what do you think about this hopeful monster mechanism? And there's one thing that comes to their mind immediately. Where are you going to get a date for Saturday night? Okay, you're the only one of your kind. There aren't anything else like you. And it can't be an identical twin. That'd be the same sex and so on. So even if in some wild statistical miracle you still got something like that, there'd be no way to reproduce, no way to multiply after kind. And he does admit that at least that's a major difficulty with this particular idea. Now, if science were actually based on logic and observation, like it used to be before it became a search for naturalistic explanations instead of a search for truth, let's just apply a scientific test here. Evolution is based on genetics that have never been observed. We've never seen anything slowly and gradually change from one kind to another. We've never seen anything jump from one kind to another. Although the hopeful monster mechanism could be tested, has been tested in the laboratories, just failed all the tests. Evolution is based on genetics that have never been observed, on fossils that have never been found. What did they dig up, as Ken said? Nothing. What did they label it? Missing. How did they know there was anything there to be missing in the first place? Genetics that have never been observed, fossils that have never been found. What about the case for creation? Look at the Bible, you get the idea that God created things to multiply after their kind, well designed to multiply after their kind. What's that based on? We take a look at God's world, it's based on the laws of genetics that we put into practice every day. It's amazing. In evolution books, as they summarize the laws of heredity, they'll say the fundamental law of heredity is, quote, like begets like. Exactly right. Right out of the beginning of Genesis and so on. And it's based on fossils found by the millions on all the continents around the world. And so as a scientist, I tend to prefer a theory that's based on what we can explain, what we do observe. And that's creation, not at all evolution. What's science telling us about evolution? Science is falsified. The theory of evolution as it's taught over and over again in schools right around the country. If the evidence is as clear and simple as I'm suggesting it is, even scientists who disagree with my creationist stand would at least say, well, you know, he's right about the evidence, we'll just be looking for a different theory. And that's true, some of them do. I was talking about, went down to hear Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winner on DNA, and Leslie Orgel, Miller's co-author. Ken talked a lot about Miller's experiment and so on. Another famous scientist talk about the origin of life. And my students urged me to go down there, you know, and embarrass them with all these tough questions and so on and so forth. I was a little bit reluctant, but we went down anyway. I didn't have to say a thing. The evolutionists just riddled their own theory, all kinds of full of holes and so on. And afterwards, I was getting a little bit of courage, and I went over to Leslie Orgel, and I said, you know, I think we have evidence for creation. I kind of stood back. I thought he'd either laugh at me or have the sergeant at arms throw me out or something like that. And he said, oh, I know what you mean. I know what you mean about evidence of creation. Here's one of the major figures researching chemical evolution. He says, but I believe in 50 years we'll have evidence for evolution. He's the one that's writing the books. He knew that his belief was based on faith in something scientists might someday find. He knew that my faith was based on the evidence that we have right now, plus faith that God's Word tells us what we're going to happen in the future. What did I say? See you in 50 years. And the more time that's gone by, the better the case for creation's God. But at bottom, it's still faith. We have the faith in the Word of God. He had the faith that maybe someday science would come up with some evidence to support his belief. Well, that conference in Chicago that Ken mentioned, so they were looking at exactly what we're talking about. This wasn't a side issue. This is why they got together. Can microevolution, little changes, mutation plus natural selection? I used to tell people, well, you know, do you believe in evolution or microevolution? I used to say yes, to try to be as conciliatory to evolution as I can, because I certainly believe in mutations and natural selection. But then somebody warned me, if you say that, people will misinterpret it. They think you believe in a little evolution. If you wait long enough, you'll believe in a lot of evolution. But these processes here don't go along with big evolution. That's what the evolutionists were saying. If you take a look at mutation, natural selection, can you extrapolate? Can you logically add up plenty of time to this and go from little bits of change to big change, macroevolution? The answer, as Ken pointed out from the evolutionists, no, you can't. Another famous evolutionist, Garrett Hardin, is very well known as an anti-creationist. Beautiful book, 39 Steps to Biology, describing the wonders of nature and so on. His first chapter, fearfully and wonderfully made, using that phrase from Psalm 139. Second chapter, nature's challenges to the theory of evolution. Notice you don't have to have creationists come into a classroom and present evidence for creation. Every time a student looks through a microscope or a telescope, they're bombarded with evidence of creation. I think that ought to be a lot of comfort, by the way. That even if they won't let us or try to suppress us from presenting creation in the classroom, all you got to do is go on a field trip. All you got to do is look at the real world, And that evidence of creation, God is speaking directly. The stones cry out for the truths of God's Word. But we want a chance to show that, have people look at that consciously and so on. And so he talked about the cleaner fish I mentioned, things like the bombardier beetle and the woodpecker. Only a few of the problems facing evolutionists committed to Darwinian theory. Then a rare moment of candor, his last 3 sentences in the intro. Is the evolutionary framework wrong? Now certainly that ought to be legitimate in a science classroom, shouldn't it? You know, where's Clarence Darrow when you really need him? You know, back at the time of the Scopes trial, the evolutionists were saying it's wrong to teach only one idea in school. It's wrong. Now that theirs is the only idea taught in school, strangely silent. Now it's right to teach only one view in school. Why do they do that? Why do they want evolution only and not creation? If evolution were overwhelmingly supported by the scientific evidence, what's the best way to stamp out creation? Let these poor little misguided Christian children bring in their evidence and just show them how stupid they are. They won't do it, will they? What's the only way an evolutionist can win a scientific argument is to make sure you don't hear the other side of the story. So they've got to use a smokescreen, science and religion. We can't talk about that. Now it's right to present only one view and so on, because they don't want to face these issues. But Garrett Hardin said, no, is the evolutionary framework wrong? Certainly that's legitimate. Does the theory mismatch the evidence? That's something you can always do in a science classroom. But he went further. Was Paley right? Paley was a thinker in the century before Darwin who argued the kind of design we see in the living world points us to a designer, not just an impersonal force, but a personal creator God. And Michael Denton, that well-known scientist who hasn't yet become a Christian, but he's aware of these problems in evolution and so on, wrote in there, Paley triumphed. It turns out he was right. His argument that the watch implies a watchmaker is even a stronger argument than it was back in his time, now that we know the intricacies of the living self. Think about it. Think about it. And don't we wish our young people were given that opportunity to think about these things, to look at evidence on both sides of the issue? Well, one thing you might want to think about, though, that means you got to be prepared. What's God's rule? Be ready to give a reason for the hope that's within you in gentleness and meekness. And you can expect those questions. Where did Cain get his wife, and all of these sorts of things and so on. What about that variation that we see among people today and so on? And the example that comes up over and over again, look at all the different kinds of people today, all the variation in skin color. Well, as Ken pointed out to you, everybody has exactly the same skin color. You never met anybody with a skin color different from yours. We all have the same skin color, a protein called melanin. The only difference is the amount of that one skin color we have. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? An awful lot of fuss has been made out of this one particular protein. The only exception are albinos that have no skin, hair, eye color at all and so on. Well, so we can rephrase the question, how long would it take to get all the variations we see in skin color? 1 million years? No. 1,000 years? No. 100 years? No. 1 generation. 1 generation would be plenty of time. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us what skin color our first parents had, but from a design point of view, the easiest place to start would be in the middle with medium skin color. Well, there are at least 2 pairs of genes, big and little a, big and little b, that control the amount of skin color we have. So let's assume that Adam and Eve, our first parents, had medium skin color like this. It might have taken 2 generations if it was some other star, but look what happens in 1 generation. Among the children of Adam and Eve, Cain, Abel, Seth, their brothers and sisters and so on, some would have all capital letter genes, the darkest possible skin color. A brother or sister sitting across the dinner table or whatever they had, all little letter genes and the lightest possible skin color. On average, 6 out of 16 would be medium skinned like their parents, 4 a shade darker, 4 a shade lighter. That's the normal situation in India at the present time. Among the India Indians, I'll say it that way since I'm largely American Indian, among the India Indians, some are as dark as the darkest African, some are as light as the lightest Norwegian. Most are somewhere in between. And that's just normal. We knew a family one time from India, when they sat down around the dinner table, among the children of the same mother and father, every skin color you can imagine anywhere was right there in that one family. A few years ago, there was a little caption in the paper. An Englishman had married a Nigerian woman that he met on the mission field, and they had twin boys. Now, these were fraternal twins. One as dark as his Nigerian mother, one as light as his English father. And it made the news, but it shouldn't have. That's just perfectly ordinary genetics, nothing unusual at all. But notice what happens when people break up and begin to multiply and fill the earth, especially after the Tower of Babel, when they're broken up into smaller groups by the language barrier. If people that have very dark skin only marry people with very dark skin, all they can pass on are capital letter genes, and the children come out very dark, generation after generation after generation. This chart, by the way, is in that What is Creation Science book, and maybe in the Answers book as well. And then if you have people with only little letter genes, what happens? Then all they can pass on are little letter genes. The children come out very light generation after generation. It's possible to get stuck in the middle. Now, this kind of variation here gives you everything in one generation, but let's suppose the mother and father both had 2 big A's and 2 little B's. Then what happens? Then you wind up with only medium skin generation after generation, like the Orientals and the Polynesians, and my ancestors, the American Indians. And so all of this, what happens in the West Indies where this study was done, when people get back together again, you're back to no more and no less variation than God built into our very first parents. Take a look at this little figure up here. This was calculated by an evolutionist, although anybody could do it. The average human couple today could have a number of offspring written as a 1 followed by more than 2,000 zeros. More than the stars in the universe, more than the atoms in the universe, more than the electrons in the universe, before they'd run out of variation and have to have an identical twin. There is a lot of variation stored in just 2 people. And it's not all visible to start with. What's one thing Adam and Eve couldn't do? Sing in 4-part harmony, right? Okay? But right away, the gene, it's just a big and little V gene, we can call them, and right away they're children. 4-part harmony, right away the very first thing. And so what happens is people multiply and fill the earth. All of these new combinations come to light. And that's kind of exciting. I was giving a talk in Canada one time talking about the horrors of mutation, how everything's getting worse and worse and worse. And somebody came up and says, isn't something getting better? And I felt kind of bad about that, and I started to think about it. And you know, really it is. Thanks to the recombination of genes, this shuffling of genes God built in ahead of time, not evolution, entelechy, an unfolding of the variety God built into the beginning. Thanks to all that variation and individuality God built in, every child born is an absolutely unique, never to be repeated combination of traits. They are special. You know, little children like to sing that song, God made me special, I'm the only one of my kind. Guess what science tells us? Boy, is that right. That is really true. Each one of them needs to be absolutely treasured. And we still don't know whether we've had the greatest mathematical genius, the fastest runner, the highest jumper, the best musician, all of that, to the extent that's tied up in genes, those magic moments that God built in at the very beginning are still waiting to come to visible expression in our children. Next time you look at your children, just kind of think about just exactly how special they really are. You know, sometimes evolutionists say, well, you know, we believe in change, you guys believe nothing ever changes. Exactly the opposite. Evolution believes in such a slow, gradual change, you know, you never see anything. A few genes thrown together by time and chance that expand over long periods of time to produce all these changes. A view falsified by both genetics and the fossil evidence. What do we believe? God created things with a tremendous amount of variation built in ahead of time. Large gene pools so that as they began to multiply and fill the earth after creation, after the fall, after the flood, they would break up into different subtypes that would express different aspects of the Creator's ingenuity and artistry and so on. Occasionally, some of these types lose the ability to interbreed. They become, in a sense, new species, but not evolutionary new species. They have less information than there was in the original population. So we see change, all right, creation, God building into the creation a tremendous variety. God is really the author. You've heard the saying, you know, variety is the spice of life. Well, God appears to agree with that. And He produced tremendous variation in individuals, human beings, and others. And then, of course, we do see mutations, not explaining the origin of of species at all, but the origin of disease and disease organisms. Does that happen after the fall? Then natural selection, the struggle for survival is real. All you got to do is read Genesis 3. It's extremely real. And it works to slow down the effects of mutations and disease, and it helps to sort out living things into groups as they multiply and fill the earth after death entered the world. But praise God, that's not the last change we see, is it? The last change is when Christ comes again to make that new heavens and that new earth in which righteousness dwells. By the way, how long is that going to take? How long is that shift from mortality to immortality going to take? The twinkling of an eye. In the twinkling of an eye, God can change us dramatically like that. Even so, come Lord Jesus. Hasten that day when they'll not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, but the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Now that's a message you can share, isn't it? You know who shared it for us? By the way, I should have brought it along. A little cartoon in the Sunday paper by BC. There's a lot of these things that are just fabulous, little creationist cartoons and so on. And he says the world that we live in can't be just a place for terrorists and crooks and things like that. It was a gift of love, not war. You think back on what Darwin said, the war of nature. And we have the power through grace, not in ourselves, but through the power of God, to make it like before. Restore it to that original created form as we turn to Christ and trust Him.
Well, that concludes our presentation. And one more thing, that's to tell you about Creation Magazine. It's the easy way for your whole family to stay up to date on creation and evolution. Creation Magazine is your family's vital defense against all those evolutionary textbooks, nature shows and magazines that abound today. 56 pages of full colour with no paid ads are sent to your home 4 times a year. Subscribing helps the message to keep on expanding as you're able to share this exciting material with others. Once again, thanks for joining us, and if you have any questions, contact us direct.